Good evening, everybody. Just bear with me while I finish getting everything set up. So we're going to get the links shared on YouTube, on Facebook. Then we'll be getting going. Facebook. Bear with me, having a little bit of an issue here. Almost there. Just keep bearing with me. Encyclopedia post. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. I am, as always, your host, Kevin Mears, demonologist and the Paranormal Encyclopedia. I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is Dracula. I want to point out for frequent listeners who may be going, really, again? Because I've talked about him a bunch. I'm doing this because I was requested to do this last week. And I like to try to fulfill people's requests like that. Not that I terribly mind talking about Dracula, let's be honest. For those of you who are fellow Dracula fans, I would highly recommend you check out the first link in the description, which is a link to my good friend Dacre Stoker's Etsy shop. He has some really cool Dracula merchandise on there. Pillows and bags and shirts and things like that. It's a lot of fun. Prices are pretty reasonable. It doesn't seem to be on there, but he also actually has, and I absolutely love it. I'm planning on buying this and probably a few of his other things to dress things up a little around here. Maybe the shelf behind me. But it is a Bram Stoker bobblehead. And it's just absolutely hilarious. Maybe I'm just easily amused, but I think the thing's adorable and I want one. Just waiting for money to go. You know how it is, money to go through accounts, all the happy stuff. But I'm not doing this because I'm getting anything from Dacre. He's a great guy. He's been very supportive of me and the show, and I really appreciate that. And so it's a good shop, and I think people should definitely go check it out. I also, for those of you who don't know, Dacre is the great-grandnephew of the legend himself, Bram Stoker. He has written the family-approved prequel to Dracula, and Dracul, and it's the approved sequel to Dracula, Dracula the Undead. They're both really good books. You can find them on Amazon. You can find them on Audible. You can find them all over the place. I suggest you check them out because they're good stuff. Here we go. I'll put a link to the bobblehead in the description as well. But again, good guy, good books. Teresa, I don't think you can talk about Dracula too much, but there are people who would probably say that I do. I am definitely a Dracula fanboy, and that's a big deal to me, particularly because Dracula is how this whole thing. If it wasn't for the novel Dracula, we might not all be sitting here right now. That is what got me down the road of being interested in the paranormal. So I don't think you can talk about Dracula too much. Some people seem to think you can. Who's to say? Well, then again, if you're not all that interested in the guy, you don't have to watch. But I am, so I'm going to talk about him. So let's clear. Here's one of the things I find the funniest over the years, particularly when I was a kid. Because when I was a kid, I was obsessed with monsters and the paranormal and Dracula. And I spent some years trying to explain to my parents that yes, Dracula is a real person. Even today, not as often. I'll see questions on various places on the internet. Was there an actual Dracula? And the answer is yes, there was. He was a man. Vlad III. He was the ruler of an area we call that was called at the time Wallachia, which is now part of Romania. His father's name was Vlad II. Big surprise. He had two brothers. His older brother Minia, and then his younger brother Radu. He was born into a difficult time in European history, particularly Eastern European history. He was born in 1431. This time, the Turks had spent a lot of time invading Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. And Vlad II, his father, was technically a member of an order of knights known as the Noble Order of the Dragon. Their sworn duty was to protect the Christian Europe from the Islamic invaders, from the Turks. In fact, in honor of his role in that order, he named himself Dracul. This is something a lot of people misunderstood about Dracul and Dracula. The name Dracul means the dragon. Drac, from Draco in Latin, meaning dragon, and ul meaning the. You will see people say that it means the devil. And that's technically true. It can mean both, relating to the fact that the devil's historically very much associated with dragons, particularly in the Bible. But, again, his name is a reference to this Order of the Dragon, not to Satan himself. And it was supposed to be a good thing, that he was a protector of Christianity, not a devil worshiper or Satanist. And then when his son was born, his middle son, I want to say, Vlad III was born, he gave his son the name Dracula. The A at the end of it means son of. So son of the dragon. Again, yes, it can mean son of the devil, but it's not in the spirit of the translation. The thing to remember, because this is another thing that for some reason confuses people to no end, is Draco is of course Latin for dragon, and people are like, but it's in Romanian, not Latin. Yeah, yes. But the thing to remember is that Europe has these things called Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, which are all languages that are rooted in Latin, as opposed to English, which is more rooted in German. Although we have a bunch of Latin loaner words as well. Romanian is a Romance language. It draws from Latin. In fact, the reason it's called Romania is because of the Roman settlers there. Romania, it makes sense. The Romans were hardly the only people who settled the area. There's also a lot of Slavs, and there's a big German population, particularly during Dracula's time, which is a whole other issue we'll get into. But at any rate, that's a situation that's going on in Europe at the time. And the problem that happens pretty quickly in Dracula's lifetime is that his father basically becomes a vassal of the Turks. His father is supposed to makes an alliance with the Sultan, and in return for which he sends his two sons to the court of the Sultan, and they're held hostage essentially. against their father's good behavior. Under Murad II. Because Muhammad was the one who's most famous. Okay. But in that time, they learned. I mean, and keep in mind, when I say that they were held hostage under the Sultan, they wouldn't have been like thrown in. It's not like you think of today, where they'd be thrown in this dank dungeon and treated horribly. They would have been treated as prisoners, or they would be treated as, to an extent, as guests, as long as Dad was behaving himself. And they would have been treated well. There's plenty of evidence that Radu, Vlad's younger brother, came close with Mehmed II, or the man who would be Mehmed II, who was. Let's see. I'm sorry. I'm double checking some things because I think who would ultimately become the Sultan, who's critical to a lot of this story. But, in fact, there's a fair amount of evidence that Mehmed II was homosexual, or at least bisexual, and had a number of male lovers, and that Radu was probably one of them. Radu did very well under the time that they were prisoners of the Turks. Vlad, not so much. There's a lot of evidence that a lot of the forms of torture he later became famous for, particularly impalement, he learned in his time with the Turks. But eventually the problem became that Dad stopped doing what he was told. And Vlad and Radu weren't killed, surprisingly enough, but ultimately would make their way back to Romania. And Vlad would in time take the throne as not count, because this is a common misunderstanding people have, is people think of the book and they think of him as as Count Dracula, but his title is more accurately Voivod, which would be better translated as Prince, or more probably most accurately Warlord. But he takes the throne. His father and his older brother die. In fact, his older brother was buried alive not by the Turks, but by the boyars, which were the landed nobility. They were basically like the mayors in Wallachia. But he would take over Wallachia in 14. I'm sorry, I'm terrible with dates. So around, it looks like 1448, he would take over Wallachia. And he'd set up his first, because of three. In fact, he ruled the country 3 times because he kept getting driven out and having to take over again. But he ruled, and then in October he would be driven out. Another big thing that happens is in this time for that, or would happen in his lifetime for that matter, is that the big enemy he would have was Mehmed II. That's the Sultan Dracula was head to head with most. To give you guys a point of reference, Mehmed was a pretty big deal as Sultans go. Famously, there's the city of Constantinople that fell to the Turks in 1453, and then would be renamed, famously, of course, renamed Istanbul. And there's the whole. They might be giant song about this. Istanbul now, Constantinople now. It's Istanbul. now Constantinople. And there's actually some evidence Vlad fought in the battle there. But eventually he would have to leave. He would be exiled. And he actually lived in the Ottoman Empire, and then he moved to Moldavia, and then eventually he would regain his throne in 1456. Ruled till 1461. He had a whole bunch of problems with both the Germans and with the Turks. He would ultimately flee for a second time in 1462. He would go. In fact, he went to Transylvania seeking help from Matthias Corvinus, who was supposed to have been his ally for a long period of time, going back to his father's reign. Instead, he was he was taken prisoner and held until 1475, when he finally was agreed to marry Corvinus's daughter and convert from Eastern Orthodox traditional religion of Wallachia to Roman Catholicism, in return for getting aid both from Corvinus and from the Pope. And he would retake Wallachia in 1475, and then in 1476, in battle with the Turks, he was ultimately slain by somebody. History is not actually all that sure who. So that's a real quick overview. So you have there's 3 times he would rule his country, not for very long altogether. And of course, the name he's most famous for, other than Dracula, would of course be Tepesh or Zepesh, which is Romanian and means the Impaler. It's actually a name he was given by the Turks because of what Vlad liked to do with his enemies. Now, this often gets misrepresented and made to look a lot more pleasant in fiction. And forgive me because we're going to get a little graphic here. But what would happen is a big wooden pike would be raised up in a courtyard or in some area. And then the victim would be lowered butt first onto this pike, which was greased up. What usually would happen here is it would actually be blunted. If there was a particular feeling of mercy, it would be sharper, but usually it was blunted. So it would pass up through the person's body, nudging organs out of the way, and eventually work its way out through the mouth as gravity pulled the body down. It wasn't organ damage or blood loss that actually usually killed them because it didn't puncture. But as it worked its way through the body, it would cut off liquids, and the person would die of dehydration very quickly and very painfully. It usually took hours. He would, and this much we know for certain, he would raise forests of people like this and leave them, usually to terrify his enemies. It was a very, very good tactic on his part. Thank you. Excuse me a moment. Little throat spray since my throat seems to be a little rough tonight. My fiance was kind enough to grab it for me. But we know he did that. He did some other things as well. But there is a great deal of question of what he actually did, how far he went. Some of the stories are probably not true. Some of them almost certainly aren't true. Some of them are true or probably true, and some of them are probably distortions. For example, there's a famous story of how he collected all the poor people in his country. And I talked about this last week, but he collected all the poor people and offered them this huge lavish feast at his castle. Then he asked him, "Is there anything else I can do for you? And can you relieve us of our worldly problems?" He's like, I'll be happy to do so. Orders the men to seal off the room and set it on fire and murder them whole horribly. I don't think that he actually did that to poor people. I do think he actually did that. Because here's what you find out. His father and his brother were murdered. Specifically not by the Turks, but almost certainly by the boyars, the landed nobility. Vlad didn't care a whole lot for them, for good reason. Aside from the fact they had not only murdered, but buried his older brother Mynea alive. And they confirmed this. When he was later excavated, they could find the scratch marks in the lid from the fact that he was still alive when he was buried. The men that were responsible for the murder of his father and his brother were in that room when he set it on fire. It was brutal. I'm not saying it wasn't. It was sadistic. I'm not saying it wasn't. But this was the era. Yeah, this is the 15th century. This is smack dab in the witch hunts. Burning people alive wasn't unknown, and at least some of these people were murderers, and a lot of the other ones were thieves. The boyars were very cruel to the peasants. They'd steal land, steal money. So this isn't Vlad is just this cruel psychopath who burned all these people alive because he thought it was funny. There was a logic to it. There are other stories of how he was in a village one day. He saw a peasant whose one sleeve was much shorter than the other, and demanded to see the man's wife, had her impaled for not doing her proper duties. There's stories of how he would impale breastfeeding women twice, one through either breast, and then impale the child on top of the two spikes. There's a story of a pair of ambassadors that were sent by the Sultan. And, of course, in Romania and most of Europe, it's very traditional. When you go to see nobility or royalty, you bow when you remove your head covering. They bowed, but they removed their turbans, but they had a skull cap underneath, and they refused to remove that for religious reasons. And the story goes that he said, "I will help you keep your custom," and then ordered his men to nail the skull caps to their heads. Is that true? I don't. Are a lot of these stories true? I don't know. Because here's the problem: a lot of the stories we hear about what a sadist and what a monster he was were written by the Germans, who he warred with in the early parts of his reign. They didn't care for him. The Russians, who he had wars with, and the Turks, who he constantly warred with. And a lot of them, not only that, were a lot of them written by his enemies. A lot of them were written 50 to 100 years after he died. So there's a serious question of how much of it's true and how much of it's exaggeration by his enemies, and turning him into more than a monster than he really was. Again, I am not by any means claiming that Vlad was a pacifist or a soft, nice guy. He wasn't. But I think some of the stories are exaggerated. I think a number of the stories are untrue. But there's probably nuggets of truth in there. And I think certainly he dealt very brutally with his enemies. But I think a lot of his actions, a lot of his atrocities were either carried out against people he was at war with, the Germans, the Turks particularly, or against or were methods of execution for criminals and other people. That we could have a whole other debate about the nature of capital punishment and the use of torture, and I'm not condoning either of those things. But there's a big I think we can all agree, whether you think it's right to kill someone or not, there's a huge difference between executing a convicted murderer or a convicted thief or executing a woman because she didn't do a good enough job sewing her husband's shirt. There's also the way that he used these kinds of tactics. For example, like I said, the Turks during his second reign hit the Turks. Mehmed actually had enough of Vlad's shit, as it were, and invaded Romania personally. Led the army. was considered, this is in the 1460s, was completely surprised. And we're talking about an army of 150,000. And this is a response, and in his defense, it's a response to Vlad's own invasions. But he attacks Wallachia in 1462. And Vlad practices a scorched earth campaign. Everywhere the Turks go, land salted, wells are poisoned, nobody's there. Because Dracula just keeps pulling back and pulling back and pulling back. And being chased. He uses a number of quite brilliant tactics. He's among the first people to use trench warfare tactics in war. Some of the earliest uses of cannons and rifles. And the other thing that he would do is he would find any of his subjects were suffering from the plague, the yellow fever, any of the major diseases of the day. He'd dress them up in Turkish clothes and send them into the Turkish camps. And the ones that made it back alive were given huge, generous grants of land and wealth. He treated the subjects that were loyal to him, he treated very well. There are people living in Romania even now that have deeds of land that were originally given to their ancestors by Dracula. A lot of it, particularly during this campaign, as he fled. So the Turks chase him to Turgovist. Turgovist was the capital of Wallachia. They think for sure he's going to make a stand there. Gates of the city are open. The city's empty. They make their way through the city. They come out the other side. And they're met by according to some reports, as many as 20,000 people impaled on wooden spikes, including two men that Sultan Mehmed recognized as emissaries he had sent to Dracula that were in fact assassins. Mehmed looks at this and goes that a man who's capable of this is capable of anything. And that wasn't actually fear, that wasn't disgust, it was actually respect. Mehmed greatly respected Vlad as this brilliant tactician who was willing to go that far. But Mehmed left the country. He left the army in the hands of Radu, and he went the heck home. I'm sorry, I forgot something important. Just before they had progressed through the city of Turgovist, Dracula personally led a midnight attack on Mehmed's encampment. Midnight charge straight in through the encampment, full-on run to try to assassinate the Sultan. Nearly succeeded. It was only at the very last minute that the personal guards of the Sultan managed to rally and save his life. But again, Vlad was a lead from the front kind of general. He was not the sit in the back and let his men die. He fought. But he would ultimately retreat to Transylvania. On the way, he would stop at his castle at Ponare, which is where a story that's made famous by Francis Ford Coppola's movie Bram Stoker's Dracula comes in. Which is the death of Vlad's first wife. One moment. Princess Cneagina, Cneagna. She was a princess of Moldavia. But she would ultimately ultimately, they were at the castle at Panare, which is the one up in the mountains, one people think of. And an arrow was fired into a window by a Romanian who had been impressed into the Turkish army, warning Vlad and his wife to flee because he knew that the city was to be taken, or the castle was to be taken. And she, not willing to see the fall of the castle, threw herself into the river, which is how it gained the name the Princess River. Ultimately, he would flee to Transylvania to be met by Corvinus, hoping that he would be given an army to go back and fight and retake his country. Instead, he was imprisoned for years in Hungary. We're not entirely sure when he was there and how long. It wasn't a severe imprisonment. He was able to gradually win his way back into the favor of King Matthias. He was able to meet and marry a member of the royal family, which, as I understand it, or the cousin of the king, not actually his daughter. I was mistaken on that. But it was, as I understand it, it was condition of his release. But he had 2 sons with his wife. He became a member of the Roman Catholic Church. They rode out, tried to get the support of the Pope, tried to rally people to help him retake Wallachia. And then he'd be released in 1474. His sons apparently were about 10 years old when he would reconquered Wallachia. So he was released in 1474. He would attack in 1475. He would attack Wallachia with a mixed force of Transylvanians, Wallachian boyars, and Moldavians. So the Moldavians sent by Stephen III of Moldavia, who was his cousin. One thing I've seen in at least one movie was that Radu was in charge at the time, which is untrue. Radu, the handsome Vlad's brother, was dead by this point. But what's becomes interesting here is the Transylvanian who joined Vlad in this attack, Stephen of Bathory, or Stephen Bathory of Transylvania, would help lead the attack. Or Stefan, excuse me. Stefan Bathory is a distant ancestor of the infamous Elizabeth Bathory, aka Elizabeth Bathory. Then in 1476, he would, around December, he died. There's a couple versions of what happened. Some stories say that he died in battle against the Turks near Bucharest. Others claimed he was killed by disloyal boyars from the Wallachians, or during in the war against the Turks. Others or during a hunt. He would die. Suppose a lot of the more common ones say he died in war, surrounded by the bodies of his loyal bodyguards from Moldavia. Some even suggest he was killed by his own men. One thing that's generally agreed upon is, in most versions where he died in battle, he died surrounded by the bodies of his enemies. He was a great warrior in his own right. Well, what we do know, even though we don't know exactly how he was killed, we do know that the Turks cut his head from his dead body and sent it preserved in honey to the city of Istanbul. Mehmed would ultimately have it displayed on a stake as proof that the Kazkili Bey, their name for him, was dead. Nobody knows exactly where he was buried. The traditional suggestion is at Snagov, which is one of a number of monasteries that Vlad would build in his own lifetime. But funny enough, way back in the day when I used to do the radio show with Lou, we had one of the most noted scholars on Vlad the Impaler, Raymond McNally, on the show. So I asked him, What happened to the head? Does anyone know? Does anybody ever try to find out? Radu's suggestion, and here's the part that's true, and then here's the part that's speculation, but I rather like. The part that is true is the reality throughout the world, just about, I think, but certainly in Europe and among the Turks, was being an executioner is not a full-time job. God willing, there just aren't that many executions that need to be performed. So normally you have something else you do during the day to make money, particularly because executioners don't necessarily want to advertise their executioners. But we do know, and a common job among the Turks for executioners was gardeners. In fact, the head executioner of the Sultan was the head gardener for the palace. Raymond's speculation is that the head was probably buried in the palace gardens, gradually decomposed, and then through the process of decomposition, the head of Vlad the Impaler would eventually make its way into a Turkish salad. Obviously, we don't know. I kind of like that story. So that's the major details of the reign that we know for certain. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of legends. There's a story, for example, of a merchant that was traveling through Wallachia who was robbed by bandits. So he went to Vlad and asked for help. Vlad is known not to have been fond of thieves. And Vlad promised to take care of the matter and sent the man away. He ordered two things. One, that money out of his own treasury be used to repay the merchant every coin he had lost, plus one additional gold coin. And as well that they hunt down and capture the brigand that was responsible. The merchant came back before Dracula. It said, "My lord, I must thank you for your wisdom. Justice, every coin has been returned to me. In fact, there was an additional one." And Vlad says, "Go in peace. I put the additional coin there as a test. If you had not been an honest man, you'd be impaled with the men responsible for robbing you." And the merchant left, and of course the thief for thieves were executed for their crimes. There's another story of travelers that stopped at a well in Wallachia and found this beautiful jewel-encrusted cup that was left there so people could drink from the well. They come back 10 years later. In some versions of the story, one of them accidentally leaves a purse of coins. They come back 10 years later, the cup's still there, and the version where they left their purse is still there, and not a single coin is touched. Because of the law and order that Vlad had engendered during his reign. The man was not a saint. He was quite brilliant in his strategies, in his tactics. He was extremely effective in the use of psychological warfare, biological warfare, firearms. But he was also cruel, sadistic, and he killed thousands. The thing I want to point out, because I actually have a fair amount of respect for the man just because of what he faced. I mean, he managed to impress and to some extent terrify one of the great military minds of the Turks, Mehmed. He held on, in the 3 times he was defeated, it was all ultimately by betrayal. He never just straight lost a fight. It's people that were supposed to be on his side turned against him or didn't ally with him the way they had promised. And there's also just the reality of Talking about Eastern Europe, and we're talking about 15th century Eastern Europe. As brutal and sadistic as he is, this is the height of the Spanish Inquisition. The witch trials are going on throughout Europe. This is not far off from the Borgias. This is not far off from Cromwell's reign in England. This is not far off from Ivan the Terrible in Russia, or Elizabeth Bathory in Hungary, about a century, I want to say. This is a brutal, bloody time in the history of Europe. By today's standards, it's very easy to look back and judge him as this monster. By the standards of his own time, I'm not so sure. Because again, a lot of the most brutal and most lurid stories were told by people who hated him. And you don't want your history to be written by people that thought you were a monster just for being at war with them. England has a very different version of the history of the Revolutionary War than America does. People say history is written by the victors. It's not entirely true. It's just you hear your country's version of war. You don't usually hear the other side. The other side is often different. And this is a case where we only have the other sides. So, that covers Vlad. I mean, there's a lot more that could be said. I mean, there's entire books that have been written about Vlad. By all means, like I said, we know that he had 2 sons. We know that he had descendants. Sadly, as I understand it, actually, that's not really true. One of the major last living descendants of Dracula died recently. Or a few years back, I should say. So let's talk a little about the vampire thing. There is, in fact, and you can find it, the house in question, the bloodlines, which starts with his father, Vlad II, is known as the Draculesti line. The last living major member of it, at least listed here on Wikipedia, was Maya Vituzi, from 1593 to 1600. But yeah, there was a German count who was famously a descendant of his, who since passed away. But apparently, and this is a more recent thing, that Prince Charles actually may be related to Vlad, the heir to the British throne. How true it is, who knows? History being, but it's not an unreasonable idea, given the interconnectedness of royal families in Europe. But yeah, supposedly there's at least one living relative of Dracula among the monarchy of Great Britain, which is sort of awesome. Which just makes me think of the novel, of course. So let's talk about, let's talk about this whole Dracula the Vampire. First thing to realize is Romania definitely has legends of vampires. So that's part of their folklore. very much the legend of the vampire that Bram most seems to have used is the stories of the vampire from which is Eastern European, the Balkans, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. Transylvania certainly has legends of vampires. That said, there are no legends of Vlad being a vampire. There are stories of him being some other form of undead, or at least his ghost being seen around Snagov Monastery, where he may or may not have been buried, but he's not seen as a vampire. That idea was very much invented by Bram Stoker. And the thing to understand about Bram Stoker is that he wasn't writing about Vlad. This has been debated a long time, but even its main proponents, Thorescu and McNally, eventually admitted that no, he did not base Dracula the Vampire on the actual historical Vlad Dracula. Because here's the thing. Aside from the fact there are no legends of Vlad being a vampire anywhere, the closest you come is that there's a German document that calls him a vampire. But historians generally agree that they weren't actually suggesting he was some undead creature. They were suggesting that he was what we, bloodthirsty in the sense that we think of it today. But even the original novel Dracula, the vampire isn't originally named Dracula. In the original early drafts of the novel, he's known as Count Vampire, and the novel is called The Dead Undead. The title change and the character's name change happened very late, just before publication. When the legend goes when he hit upon the name in some last minute research on Romanian history. How true that is, I'm not sure. Dacre, I'm sure, would know far more about that. My understanding is that Bram had been researching Eastern European history and folklore for months before he wrote the novel. It may be that he stumbled upon it again. It may be that a friend of his suggested it, because he had a friend who was a professor of Eastern European history, who helped him with some of his research. But he made the change late. The details he gives for Dracula are completely wrong. He places Castle Dracula in Transylvania, in the Carpathian Mountains near Borgo Pass. Forgive me, and I'm not going to look it up, but he places on a specific volcano in the Carpathians, which is a lovely, very cool setting for the novel. I've never been to Romania, but the pictures I've seen of the Carpathians, the whole area is absolutely gorgeous. And there is a castle called Bran Castle that is very near. It's not exactly, but it's near where Bram puts Dracula's castle, and it's been often speculated that that's the castle Bram had in mind. It's not. There's no real evidence Bram was even aware of Bran Castle when he wrote the novel. But it just happens to be a beautiful, intact castle in the right part of near the right part of Transylvania, so that the Romanian government has capitalized on, because it looks the part. Because the reality is the castle at Panare, which was his actual castle, is in ruins. But it's not that the actual. Bran is not the actual castle. He didn't live there. He may have stayed there at some point in his life, because certainly, again, his father, and he was born in Transylvania. He had close ties to Transylvania. But he was not a ruler of Transylvania. He ruled Wallachia. He lived in Wallachia. He died in Wallachia. In the meantime, one of the long period of time he lived in Transylvania, he was actually a prisoner of the Corvinus, of Matthias Corvinus. But yes, Borgo Pass is a real place. The Carpathian Mountains are quite real. Transylvania is quite real. And the name is, I suppose, worth mentioning. The name Transylvania isn't anything particularly sinister. It's simply, trans, beyond, Sylvania, forest. It's basically, the name simply means land beyond, the land beyond the forest, or beyond the forest, or land beyond the forest. Just like Pennsylvania, means Penn's Woods. If you didn't know that, by the way. Again, and that's the other thing I find interesting is if you go to Romania, they have a love-hate relationship with the novel Dracula and the fictional figure of Dracula. They don't like it because in Romania, Dracula is a national hero. He stood up to the church. He stood up to the cruel, greedy boyars. He gave people land. He is a George Washington figure in Romania. So a lot of Romanians very understandably hate this image that he's been given as this vampire. Because the man himself was actually quite well. He was a Christian. He was devout. He did convert to Roman Catholicism for political reasons, which lost him some points because Romania is very much not a Catholic country. It's an Orthodox country. But he was a Christian. He believed in God. He was not the satanic, demonic figure. On the other hand, there's the reality of it's not the most financially successful country in the world. And Dracula brings a lot of tourist money into the country. A lot of people go because they want to see Castle Dracula and they want to be caught up in this myth. Everyone would love to go to Romania. It is pretty much number one on my bucket list is go to Romania. But I don't want to go. I wouldn't mind seeing Bran Castle because it looks like an absolutely gorgeous castle. But I want to go to Ponari. I want to go to Snagov. I want to go to Trgovice. I want to go to places that are actually related to Vlad the Man. Because as much as and don't get me wrong, I love the novel Dracula. It is I think it is one of the great novels of English literature. It has had a profound influence on my life. But the man is so much more interesting than the myth to me. And there is plenty of paranormal phenomena, I'm sure, to be found in the historical sites in terms of ghosts and things of that nature. I recommend if anyone out there listening to this ever goes to Romania, go enjoy it. Just be respectful and be aware of the way that the country sees the man versus the way the rest of the world sees the man. And certainly, there are parts. They're all over. You don't need to go to if you're just interested in vampire legends. For goodness sakes, you don't have to go to Transylvania or Wallachia or Romania. There are vampire legends all over the bloody place. If you live in the United States and you're interested in vampires, go to Providence, Rhode Island, and go find the grave of Mercy Brown. There's a vampire right here in the United States, at least according to legend. There are so, go to England and go to Whitby. They have tons of Dracula-related tourism in England. There are plenty of other options without going and making an idiot of yourself in Romania by confusing a very interesting historical man with a wonderful, well-written. I don't mean to denigrate it, but it's a piece of fiction, and you should keep that in mind. And my chat's been very quiet. Does anybody have any questions? Anything I didn't cover you'd like me to get into? Anything you'd like more details about? I would absolutely recommend that folks that are interested in this check out the book In Search of Dracula by Brad Florescu and Raymond McNally. It's an excellent resource on the man himself. There are no other books that have been written on the subject, but it's probably the first to go to. They're the ones who made a lot of the connections. They're the ones who tried to unearth famously failed to unearth his tomb at Snagov and found cattle bones. That's okay, Teresa. Teresa all goes and pig and says she's been cooking. But do you have any questions? But Um, trying to think. For that matter, I suppose it's also worth mentioning that another person who may very well have been an influence on Dracula, on the novel, it certainly plays a role in, and here, let me also give my own headcanon, my fan theory, if you will, because lots of people have fan theories about fiction, their own explanations for things and how they factor into it. I have my own fan theory about the novel Dracula, which is this. One, a lot of the history that's given for Dracula in the novel actually does fit Matthias Corvinus. But Matthias Corvinus is not a member of the Draculesti line. But there is somebody in the Draculesti line that would be a good candidate for a vampire if one of them was. And I'm not saying that he is. I mean, for goodness sakes, I don't necessarily believe in vampires, though I'm not saying I don't. I'm open-mindedly skeptical. But if anyone in the Draculesti line was a vampire, Mynea, his older brother, has potential because the whole buried alive factors into that. But I would argue if anyone in that line was going to be a vampire, it was Radu the Handsome, Radu II, his brother. Because where Vlad remained loyal and remained Christian, Radu converted to Islam and sold his family and his country to the Turks. Which means that Radu was a traitor. And in Dante, the lowest, deepest, worst circle of hell was reserved for the traitors. So my headcanon is Radu was a traitor, which would make him a candidate, and converted away from Christianity, which make him the conversion away from Christianity would make him a candidate for excommunication. Being a traitor also would put him in a bad position, spiritually speaking. But he's also the son of the dragon. He's not the one who was given the name Dracula, but he is also a son of Dracul. So I think it's an interesting thought experiment that he's the one he took the name Dracula to dishonor his brother after he became a vampire for his crimes. Which another thing I suppose worth commenting on is a lot of people ask, and it's a fair enough question, how did Dracula be in the novel? How does Dracula become a vampire? The novel is a little vague on the subject. There's nothing to suggest in the novel that he was bitten by another vampire. But there is a story in the novel that probably would explain it, which is actually also a cool story. And if you go to that first link in the description to Dacre's store, you can find a shirt that references this. So in Transylvanian folklore, there's a school that exists underneath the Carpathian Mountains called Shogomans. Shogomans is the evil version of Hogwarts. Every 13 years, they take 13 students to teach sorcery and black magic. The teacher at this school of magic is Satan himself. And each year, one of the students is given the right to ride the Zemai, which is a bloody dragon that lives underneath the school. And the dragon and the powers that student is given gives him the power to summon up storms. Also, one of the students, possibly the same one, possibly not, is basically, and this is mentioned in the novel, one of the students is kept by the devil. And essentially, this is what happened. This is how Dracula became a vampire. Is basically he makes a deal with Satan. That would be the novel's version of how he became a vampire. And to be fair, that is completely. There's a lot of things that the novel added to vampire folklore that wasn't there before. Not having a reflection is something Stoker came up with. It fits very well into legends about reflections. but it isn't really something in vampire folklore. The idea that crucifixes repel vampires was created by the novel. They mostly don't give a shit. They don't care about crucifixes. In the folklore, it's a combination of this idea of vampires as demonic. Vlad is making a deal with the devil. Gives him this vulnerability. Another common thing everybody thinks they know about vampires wasn't actually invented by the novel. It was invented by the movies based on the novel, which is the idea that sunlight is fatal to vampires. It isn't. In the novel, Dracula attacks Van Helsing and company in broad daylight. In folklore, there are vampires that sit up in their graves and start interacting with people when they're dug up in broad daylight to stake them, things of that nature. Sunlight is not fatal to vampires anywhere except modern stories and movies. Where that idea came from is the movie Nosferatu. So the black and white silent film Nosferatu is the very first there are other stories about Dracula as a vampire, but it's the first adaptation of the novel Dracula. When Murnau, the man who made the movie, went to Florence Stoker, Bram's widow, because Bram at this point had died, she turned him down. She wouldn't allow him to make the movie. So he said, you know what, we'll just call it Nosferatu instead of Dracula. Nosferatu is a German word meaning plague bearer. Bram is pretty much the first person to associate it with vampires. He didn't coin the phrase. It existed before him. There's some historical debate about what it originally meant. Most historians seem to think it was basically a term for like a typhoid Mary figure, someone who carried the plague. But he renamed the movie Nosferatu and moved it from Romania and England to Germany, and named the vampire Count Orlok. And then the big change he has is at the very end, there's this whole idea that a virgin has to keep the vampire busy all night. And then at the end of the night, with the crowing of the cock, the sun, the vampire will be destroyed. And there's this, if you haven't seen it, see it, because it is an incredibly good movie. I agree with you completely, Teresa Hall. I love that movie. It's an amazing movie. But there's just this great scene where he's the sun rising through the window and him slowly disappearing. That's where we get this idea that vampires die in sunlight. It's from the movie Nosferatu. It's a great movie, but it was a change in an attempt to avoid a copyright lawsuit. And this dodge around copyright law completely failed. Florence Stoker sued the filmmakers. The judge ruled that every copy of it be destroyed. Many of them were, thankfully for the history of cinema, some of them survived, which is why we still have the movie. Which also leads to the funny enough story that in 1930, when Todd Browning was trying to make his movie Dracula, which ultimately he would in 31, and it would be released in 1931 with the legendary Bela Lugosi playing Dracula. He had a huge problem. And Universal actually wanted the rights to make the movie. They weren't going to try and cheat the estate. They didn't want to get sued again, like Murnau had been. And Florence didn't want to release the rights. What ultimately happened is that Bela, who had been a stage actor who was playing Dracula on Broadway and a number of other places, appealed to Florence directly, wined and dined her a little, and actually convinced her to let him make the movie. The irony of all this being, Bela was not the first choice to play Dracula. And let me say this. I love Bela Lugosi. I think he was a brilliant actor. Right? I think it's downright criminal the way he got typecast, and his career was destroyed by later bad decisions that he would make. But the original choice for Dracula, the first choice Todd Browning had, would have been epic. Because the original choice for Dracula was a living legend at the time. Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces. Sadly, he died before they got permission and before they began filming. But originally, the plan was Lon Chaney, the original Lon Chaney, not his son, Crandon. And by the way, his son's name was actually Crandon. He took the stage name of Lon Chaney Jr., in tribute to his father and also for marketing purposes. But Lon Chaney himself was to play the role. And just think about it. One of the things that makes Todd Browning's movie so good is it's a very quiet movie, which is understandable because Browning was primarily a silent film director. And for that matter, we're talking about 1931. Talkies, as they were called, weren't a big thing at the time. If you had taken this legendary silent horror movie maker, Browning, and this legendary silent actor, and he's best known for, rightly so, he's best known for his silent monster roles. Though he was a very accomplished actor. He played a wide variety of roles. He played a number of heroes. He played Quasimodo. He actually did have speaking parts in a number of movies near the end of his career, but he was most known for his monsters and his silent films. If you would combine those two talents together in into this movie, it would have probably been amazing. Especially one of the great tragedies of the silent film era, in my opinion. Go when you have a chance sometime. Google Mark of the Vampire, Lon Chaney. There is a vampire. Oh no, excuse me. London After Midnight. That's what I'm thinking. London After Midnight is a vampire film that Lon Chaney Sr. made, and the makeup is chilling. It's monstrous. It's not at all what you usually think of as a vampire. The way that could have, and he did it himself because that was the thing that Lon Chaney was most famous for, is the fact that he was a makeup artist. He was a makeup artist as well as an actor, and a brilliant one at that. The look he would have given Dracula would have been very different and probably even much more monstrous and terrifying, which actually would have been more in keeping with the book. He is not this big, handsome, debonair figure in the novel. He's got a very bestial, primitive, atavistic appearance. But again, sadly, he would die before the movie they got started on the movie, so it couldn't happen. For that matter, it's always interesting. I think Bela himself was actually from Transylvania. He was born in Beloblask in a town in Transylvania called Lugos. With the name Beloblasko, he would legally change his name to Lugosi to honor the town he was born in. When he first came to the United States, he didn't even speak English. He had, in some of his first performances, in his first tryouts when he was trying to get the role, he didn't even know the language he was speaking. He learned the lines to play Dracula phonetically. Which also relates back to the accent you hear in the Lugosi movies is completely authentic. That's his natural accent. And then ultimately, when he died, he was buried in his cape at his own request. Hey, Lisa for Truth, welcome. You're kind of near the end, unfortunately. And of course, from there, Dracula has been. And of course, now I've got more people in the chat. Maybe I'll keep going for a while. It's actually not so hot today, so I don't mind being out here as much as usual. But you have all these movies and books and TV shows and cartoons and comic books and comic strips and cereal boxes, for God's sakes. All that started because Bram Stoker. And Stoker was a novelist. Dracula wasn't his first, nor was it his last novel. It's by far the best-known book he ever wrote. Although, ironically enough, he originally was trying to make it into a play. Specifically, there's a very famous actor at the time, Henry Irving, who he wrote Dracula very much with Henry Irving in mind to play the part in the play. His full play was much too long. I mean, basically, the original play is more or less the novel. And it's never, as far as I know, never actually been performed. Yes, the accent is one of the best reasons why Bela is so good at the role. For that matter, just the presence. He knew how to captivate an audience. He knew how to command. He had a very commanding presence. And funny enough, I've talked before on the show and I've done lectures before about this idea of the romantic suave vampire. And while Bela didn't invent it, Bram certainly didn't invent it. But Bela pretty much cemented it in the public, particularly the American public mindset. Because to the man the day the man died, Bela received love letters from his female fans who adored him in that role so much. It was very much. It was released on Valentine's Day. It was billed as the strangest love story of all time. Lisa, I would highly recommend reading Dracula. It could be a little bit of a tough read today because it was written in 1897, for heaven's sakes. But it is an extremely good book. It is, in my opinion, vastly superior to Interview with the Vampire. Which I mentioned it because Lisa also says never read Dracula, did read Interview with the Vampire, which was a disappointing novel. But yes, or if I'm going to listen to it on audio, you can find audio versions of Dracula just about anywhere, and particularly because it was published in 1897, so we're long past the century mark. It's in public domain. You can find audio versions of it here on YouTube. But if you look long enough, you can even find like Christopher Lee reading Dracula, which is definitely worth a listen. If you listen, for that matter, if you're interested, you can find it easily enough on the internet. But there's there's a radio drama version of it that's only about an hour long, starring Orson Welles as both Dracula and Van Helsing. And it's actually fairly accurate, if just ridiculously condensed, because of how little time they had given it. But it is a really wonderful novel, and again, it didn't invent the idea that it didn't invent vampires. It didn't invent vampire fiction, but it revitalized. It pulled the stake out of the heart, as it were. It very much is responsible for how popular vampires have become. It's been butchered so many times in so many different movies and done well. There are plenty of problems with it, but Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of the novel is actually relatively accurate. The major changes he made is at the very beginning with with Dracula's whole relationship with the church is an invention of Coppola's, and the reincarnation love story is very much Coppola, as is the ultimate ending where Mina is the one who kills Dracula. That's not accurate to the book. And in the novel, it's a combination of Quincy Morris and Jonathan Harker who killed Dracula. Morris using his big Bowie knife and Harker using a kukri dagger. But again, I'm sort of running out of steam here. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Now's probably the time I think I'm going to be wrapping up in the near future. Again, I do want to definitely plug again my friend Dacre Stoker. If you look in the description of this video, you will find links to his Etsy shop, to the Stoker State Etsy shop, and they're really, really awesome. Bram Stoker bobblehead. I don't know entirely what it is, but it just amuses me so very much. I saw that on his Facebook page the other day, on Thursday actually, which is when he announced it, because it was released on Friday. I just started laughing and had this big dumb grin. Hopefully in a few weeks I'll have some money and I'll actually go buy myself one, and I'll show you all. And there's some great T-shirts and other things that you can buy on there. Again, it's not been this This is not an endorsement for money. He has not offered me anything I have not asked for. And be clear, I have not asked him for anything. I am doing this because Dicker is a friend of mine, and he has been a very loyal supporter of me and my show, and friends support each other. When I did the Wrath of Khan a while back, and if you haven't seen it, go look up on YouTube, Wrath of Khan. It's a great convention we did. And you can find him a number of times on this channel as well that I've had him on. But he's a good guy. He's read some really good books. They also recommend checking out. And thank you, Lisa. I'm glad Teresa Hull, not Lisa, excuse me. Gulf City Pagan shares she loved hearing about Vlad. I've been fascinated with him for decades. You and me both. I'm 43. I've loved him since I was a kid. Like I said, if it wasn't for Bram Stoker's novel and for Dracula, both the man and the myth, I don't think we'd be sitting here today. I mean, I was always interested in folklore and monsters, but it was really what got me started, what really catapulted me was my love of Dracula. And, it's like Dracula's so interesting. What about vampires in general? And reading vampire legends and ghost stories and all these other things all started out from a little kid who loved the novel Dracula. Which is also why it's like, I've always kind of geeked out a little every time we've had Dicker on, because as well as being a very nice guy and a very good author, he's a great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker. To me, that is unspeakably cool, especially because he's such a nice guy. I mean, I've had the chance to meet him in person. I've had him on a number of times. He is a very nice guy as well as an excellent writer. Then again, I'm happy to say I have a lot of nice things to say about pretty much all of my guests, because I've had so many wonderful, cool people on this show, and I feel lucky to have done so. But it is now 7:20. I have been going for well over an hour at this point. There don't seem to be any more questions, so I think I'm going to wrap this up. So, folks, I want to thank you all for tuning in. I've had a lot of fun discussing this topic. I'm not sure what I'm talking about next week, but we will be back next week, 6 p.m. to 7-ish p.m. Eastern Standard Time, next Saturday, which is June 20th. Right here. I hear you, Teresa. But we'll be here back June 20th. We'll talk about something. Maybe I'll finish my research and do one on Frankenstein, because it's about bloody time we talk about Frankenstein. But that's going to do it for tonight. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed what you're hearing, please like, share, and subscribe. We're finally, praise God, coming to the end of this quarantine, although you have to wonder if we need to keep going given the outbreak, the fact we're getting hit by a second wave. But you have some money to spare, please consider donating. Patreon.com/demonology. You can go there, or you can just go to my PayPal directly. The links are for all of that are in the description, as is my email address. Feel free to email me if you have questions, comments, concerns. If you think your house is haunted, you need somebody to help you out, please reach out to me. If you live Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, New York, Maryland, that area, I can see about coming out personally. If you live farther away, it's probably not going to be me personally, but I'll help you. I'll do my best to help you find a group that can help you. I do not charge for my services, although if you want me personally to come investigate your haunted house in California, I'll come, but you're gonna have to pay for my airplane tickets. But there are extremely qualified groups in California and other places I can help you get in touch with. But that's pretty much my only rules. If you live more than 2 hours away from me, I'll ask you for gas and related expenses. Reach out if you need the help is my main point. We'll find you somebody who can help you. That's it for tonight. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good night and God bless.